Hey guys, it's Mountain Walk, and today we're going to be talking about more pre-modern decks. Another big sort of pre-modern monthly tournament, the ones I got every month. And we got some neat stuff that we're going to be looking at today, so that's pretty cool, pretty cool. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. All right, here we go. Starting at the bottom, 16. There were 77 players in this tournament. Oh my gosh, so many people. And of course we have an old favorite, Landstill. This is about as stock as it gets, and nothing weird here. Sacred Ground isn't always seen, but that's obviously quite good against things like Armageddon and so on, Wasteland, stuff like that. Certainly not sure how good it is in this metagame. Like a lot of land destruction stuff is like Parallax Tide, which doesn't destroy, it exiles, But other than that, pretty normal stuff here with a stock blue-white Landstill list. All right, and now we got Goblins. And this is Goblins with red-green Goblins. Nothing too wonky here. Again, not playing 23 lands, I think, is at least the minimum of what you really want to do. And of course, Ancient Tomb is just like not a card I like, especially like not playing any wastelands or even ports or anything is I think that's a big miss for me. Having that extra ability to interact with lands, disrupt mana, gives you an ability to actually screw with the combo decks or control decks and stuff is pretty nice, especially dealing with things like Mishra's Factory and so on. But this deck ran 4 Ancient Tombs. Again, not a fan of that. I do like 1 or 2 max, because obviously there's very big diminishing returns, and it makes other aggressive matchups more difficult. And again, you just don't need a ton of colorless mana with 4 War Chiefs. But normal stuff here outside of the Tomb. Hearth Charm, again, sometimes seen in the main deck. Just flexible card, can sometimes push Lackey through blockers and things like that. Yep, pretty typical Goblins list. All right, and now we got the great combo, the greater good combo. This thing has been randomly popping up for a while now. This looks, I'm not super familiar with what the sideboard typically plays. Like we get all sorts of stuff. A lot of cards do Enlightened Tutor for. Obviously, stuff like Pernicious Deed is pretty nice. Takes care of all sorts of hate permanents. Good against the little weenie decks, things like that. Yeah, I don't think there's anything weird here, unless there's something big I'm missing. This is a pretty typical list for that. Basically, yeah, get like it's like got it's the Pandemonium Saproling Burst thing, but also like has a Phyrexian Dreadnought, So Dreadnought plus Pandemonium is pretty good because it's only like 1 mana to deal 12 damage, which is pretty sweet. But yeah, this is pretty neat deck. It's always cool. Oh, and of course it plays Academy Rector, which is, I really like Academy Rector. I fetched a lot of bargains with that many years ago. Haven't in a while since, bargains been still banned in Legacy, but Academy Rector is a pretty sweet card. Of course, it can fetch Pernicious Deed or City of Solitude or Serenity, Seal of Cleansing, Warmth, all sorts of stuff. So cool stuff here. All right, now we got the Machine Head, which is just a typical red-black deck. Got the Terminates, no voids. That's shoot, no voids, no Urza's Rages. Um, that's okay. No one's perfect, right? You need to. I'm like the flavor police. I'm like Machine Head with no actual machines. It's got the 4 Terminate though, which is quite good. Terminate, Lightning Bolt, Firebolt, Therapy, Duress, so a lot of good removal and disruption. Ravenous Wrath, which is a sweet card. Great, you know, makes them discard. Obviously, great therapy fodder. And a couple wonky things that aren't typical. I think I've seen them before, but should call them out. A Cabal Interrogator. This card's pretty sweet. Can snipe cards from people's hands, especially with all the additional discard you have. You can really get their hand to a fairly small size, and you don't have to pay too much mana to be able to make them discard a card. So that's pretty sweet, or at least to get them to discard a card and see everything and get the card you want and all that. Yeah, a couple curse scrolls for some nice late game stuff. Some Mishra's Factories, of course, as additional pressure against control decks, which is pretty sweet. Uncounterable little dork. Gotta love it. Sideboard is full of red and black cards that do things that you would expect in red and black decks. Nothing weird there. Of course, the Bottle Gnome, so I love Bottle Gnomes. Good against stuff like Sly and Stompy and all the other aggressive decks. All right, and this is The Rock with Living Wish, which is, one of those things. Sometimes they play Living Wish, sometimes not. This one does. And it's got a bunch of cards you expect to be Living Wished for. And other than that, you have E-Plague, Naturalize, and Tormod's Crypt. Also, then just generically good cards. Yeah, there you go. Engineer Plague has all sorts of use. Pretty sweet card. Mostly against tribal decks, but has niche uses in other places, like against the Devourer decks, or even something like Hermit Druid or whatever. So, yep, good stuff here. Nothing too weird. All sorts of big beasties. Real cool. All right, now we got a blue, white, green control deck. This is the typical sort of blue, white, green deck. Not a huge fan of it. I'm not a big fan of like splashing another color to play. Like Sylvan Library is good, but there's so much good card draw in blue. It's not really worth playing another color and just opening yourself up to more vulnerable to land destruction. Guy's Blessing is fine if you're going like super late. But other than that, like, yeah, and I obviously don't really like Morphling or Radiance Dragoons. I like Dragoons better than Morphling, right? Because Dragoons at least like has a purpose and is very good at what it does, whereas Morphling is like just so slow and dirtily, and just a huge rev target. That's kind of awkward. But everything else looks about what you would expect. Yeah, nothing too weird here though. All right, and now of course we have a survival deck, and of course this one is some sort of angry survival deck, like kind of a red-green one. But we got white for some things like Monk Realist. Monk Realist, I believe that guy's white. That's the one that kills enchantments, right? An Idealist is the one that gets them back. Can't quite remember. Of course, we have Swords in the sideboard. Again, that's a pretty sweet card. And of course, Enlightened Tutor being a very good card to, well, get your survival. The deck really wants to get a survival in play, of course. Couple main deck Cradles, of course, which is not too unusual in these sorts of decks. Anywhere from 1 to 3 usually. And, and we got a Gitu Slinger. Definitely a card that isn't an unorthodox choice in these survival decks. They've played them occasionally, but it is a little bit cheaper than FTK, and it can even go face. So it's nice to have a little bit of that flexibility. Whereas FTK, if you have the mana, you'll just like, oh boy, just be slamming down Flame Tongue Kavus. But if you're tight on mana, Gitu Slinger is quite nice. Definitely fills a good role there. And nothing weird in the sideboard. All sorts of stuff. Caller against, rafts and things like that. Sharpshooter against like little dorks and things. Pyroblast against blue decks. Genesis for the super grindy matchups. Spike Feeder, of course, is good against aggressive decks. Slide, all that kind of good stuff. All right, and now, of course, we have The Rock. Except this one is playing Braids. And Dust Bowl and Wasteland main deck. But that's not too weird. Sometimes you see Braids in these kinds of decks. Braids is sweet. It's kind of a, your deck is just full of permanents and stuff. So you can always just like sack random crap to it, you know, whether it just be a stray land or like a bird or something, or a wall if those aren't relevant. Plague Spitter is nice against the aggressive decks. That's pretty sweet. Got some Blastoderms, but it's mostly a pretty standard rock list outside of the braid stuff. Yeah, nothing too weird here. Got sideboard Haunting Echoes, of course. That's a card that I like quite a bit. Definitely very good, and it's a way to sort of one up the other control decks or grindy decks or whatever. Slamming Echoes after you killed a bunch of their stuff, made them discard cards, can be game winning. So 5 mana to win the game is pretty sweet. Pretty sweet. All right, now we have Goblins List, and same old stuff. This one, of course, has 23 lands, some wastes and ports, of course, the forest in the sideboard, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, this is a typical Goblins List, about the same old stuff we've seen about a zillion times. Yeah, nothing weird here. Well, actually, let's see. That's only one Pyroblast. I definitely like, if I'm playing red-green goblins, I definitely like, at least like 2 to 3 Pyroblasts, depending on your metagame, of course. Just because it's such a good card against the blue decks. Hitting things like Foff is pretty sweet, or even just hitting, their blue blast, which a lot of times they'll board in against you, or of course hitting Chill, but you don't really need to do that too much because you already have like Naturalizes to deal with Chill or the other white hate cards. But yeah, Tranquil Domain, of course, is a pretty nice card, good against Enchantress for one, and then just other random stray enchantments. 5 is a lot of these sort of enchantment killing effects, but maybe it worked out. Who knows? Anyways, let's move on. All right, now we got the Mono Blue Storm deck, which is about the same as it's always been. Yeah, playing Cloud of Fairy, snapping it back. Pretty good with Sapphire Medallion and Helm of Awakening, makes all your stuff cheaper, so you can produce mana on all your free spells with, like Frantic Search, Snap, Cloud of Fairies, of course, that whole mana engine. Impulse, Meditate. Words of Wisdom's pretty good because once you mill them, you can make them die immediately instead of having to wait to your upkeep, which can be relevant. And of course, sideboard just full of all sorts of stuff. Defense Grid, of course, is very good against blue decks, and Hydroblast against red decks, and Turnabout is a kind of a flexible card. It can be a fog, and it can also, of course, untap your lands, which is quite nice. Crypt, Chain, Hurkyl's Recall, these things are all pretty self-explanatory. So yeah, there you go. All right. And now, of course, we have the Oath Parfait deck that's been seeing some play last month or two. This is typically just Parfait with a little bit of the mana base with stuff like Archaeological Dig and things like that to further have synergy with land tax and be kind of like a ramp spell, which is pretty sweet. Sideboard is about what you would expect. Multani is a little, you could say maybe a little spicy, but that's a typical card you will see sometimes in like Reanimator / Oath list, just because it's so good against stuff like Plow and things like that. So that's kind of neat. But Meddling Mage is obviously a very good one. I like that a lot. It stops all sorts of stuff. Well, very specific things, right? You can't play it with Meddling Mage, Chris Picula chanting and his hands shining and all that good stuff. What a sweet card. But it's also a clock too, which is quite good, and certainly something this deck could appreciate since it's pretty glacially slow. But yeah, there you go. There you go. And there you go. All right, now we have the sort of 5-color Devourer deck. This one has main deck Oath of Druids. I'm trying to remember if they've always been playing main deck Oath when they've been 5-color, or if that's just a more recent thing. So I've always seen a lot of it in the sideboard. Not sure, but that's okay. Still pretty sweet. Definitely a pretty cool idea. Another way to find and get your Devourer into play. So yeah, and you get to play Enlightened Tutor, which helps you find Devourer, of course, or your Altar. So that's pretty sweet. And then of course your sideboard is full of multicolor stuff that deals with all sorts of stuff that your opponent's going to be bringing in, or E-Plague, of course, against the aggressive decks that can race you, the tribal decks. Duress, of course, is a great pickup since it's so good, at beating up on control decks, and the extra information is quite valuable. So yeah, a lot of good stuff here. It's pretty sweet. Obviously, your mana base was not really that great, and making it a little bit worse, but you also get access to all these different cards, I think is a pretty sweet innovation. I've liked that sort of way forward. I think that's, might as well go for broke, right? Like if someone pops you and you lose, like, well, I mean, you're already probably going to lose to that anyway. So, all right, moving forward. Okay, and yeah, got bidding in a rock deck that's otherwise pretty typical. It's got some Wastelands main deck, which is, pretty nice. Everyone likes Wasteland. I'm not sure if that's better than like Dust Bowl, but hey, Wasteland, sweet, more mana efficient, certainly. 2 Spirit Monger seems a little excessive. I like one Monger. You don't really need more than one. And you don't really want to play it until it's like the last thing, because it just beats up on any random crap that your opponent can just like rip off the top or whatever. But it's pretty dirtily, and getting it countered or plowed or something sucks, obviously. But and a little bit more, we got some Plague Spitters, of course. So Plague Spitter good against the elf decks and things like that. But typical stuff here. Typical stuff here. All right, and now of course we have the Tide decks. This seems, I think this is about what it normally looks like. The Lonely Sandbar, I think, is not. I think that might be a new inclusion. I don't believe I've seen those in there before. But yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're playing 27 lands, having 3 of them be cycling lands is. I'm not going to say it's a free roll, right? Because you can get awkward hands and awkward sequencing, and obviously opening you up to Wasteland if you have to use it as a mana source, and it slows you down a turn. Again, that's pretty awkward. But it is an interesting idea, of course. So we'll have to see how that ends up working out. But typical stuff here. I kind of like Prohibit. It's a nice 2 mana hard counter, and of course it can counter most everything when you kick it, even if it is 4 mana, which is a little awkward, but it can be better than like say Mana Leak being dead in the late game sometimes, depending on what you're playing against. So interesting stuff here. Interesting stuff here. Yep, all sorts of good stuff. Sideboard is about what you would expect to. Got some Cunning Wish targets and all that good stuff. Yeah, so there you go. And of course, our second place deck, runner-up deck, we got our good friend Psychotog, or Farkatog, as this guy named it after his last name. Portent is a pretty sweet card when I've played a little bit in Tog, which is it's kind of nice. Good. I mean, obviously, don't need to sell people on cantrips. This one is pretty dang good. Kind of weird that they had both this and Brainstorm in Ice Age, but hey, whatever, right? I'm not sure if they knew how good these cards were, or if they're just like, maybe we'll play them. Who knows, right? Who knows? But this is pretty sweet. This isn't that weird of a deck. You got, well, the Cabal Pit. Sometimes you see Cephala Coliseum instead in that flex slot, but Cabal Pit can kill 2/2s and stuff, so that's kind of nice. Basic heavy mana base, deltas, underground rivers, all sorts of good stuff. I'd honestly wonder if like playing, I mean, if you're gonna play this super duper heavy on basic lands, I wonder if it would just be better to, or like make room for a couple back to basics. Just quite good against a lot of decks, and it's like another axes you can attack on that you're typically not going to be able to. So that's probably an interesting idea, one I've definitely kicked around. But the main deck Portent is pretty sweet. Also the Impulse They're playing a playset of Prohibit here, so there's a little bit of different stuff. One Wonder, 4 Psychotog, all sorts of good stuff. And the sideboard is great. Got a Null, of course. A Null is makes casting Parallax Tide look a little silly. Pretty hard to probably resolve a Tide against like Duress and Chill and even just the regular things of counter magic. Obviously, like Tog in play, you know, means Circular Logic's turned on for 1 mana, so that's kind of a pain. We also got Ghastly Demise, not typically a card you would see in the sideboard. And there's no Cunning Wish in this deck that I see, unless my eyes are betraying me. I do have bad eyesight. But Ghastly Demise is a pretty sweet card. Ghastly Demise is, you know, great against, well, non-black decks. So that's kind of interesting. So 1 mana, instant speed, black removal is pretty good, pretty good. Hydroblast, Withered Wretch, Null, Chill, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, Withered Wretch is pretty good against the slow graveyard-based decks. And it's another beater. Get in some chip damage, so you know your Tog doesn't have to go like Super Saiyan 3 all the time or whatever. So that's kind of interesting. So pretty interesting stuff. Lots of good good innovations here. I think there's just so much that you can do with these Tog decks, and so many different colors you can play. You can, you know, like red splash, straight blue black, all sorts of different lands you can play. Like I said, I also mentioned, you know, the back to basics tech, which is so powerful, especially in the control mirrors where mana is like the biggest deciding factor. All sorts of different things, all sorts of different things. Like what's your removal suite look like? What kind of counter magic are you playing? Yeah, lots of different stuff here, lots of different stuff here. So we're still going on. The Tog has a bunch of deck building space, lots of innovation, lots of stuff you can do. Definitely like Psychotog, really cool stuff. And of course we got a real spicy one. I can't remember if this exact deck was, well, we've seen variations of this thing. We've talked about Reckless Abandon, right? Which is the, you know, red, sack a dude, deal 4 to a creature or player, that thing. But now we got a very creature heavy deck. And so this is basically, I think this was typically referred to as Dead Guy Red, I believe, the creature heavier mono red decks. So this is pretty cool. This is pretty cool. So you got stuff like Mog Flunkies, which is, you know, 2 mana 3/3, but you need a bunch of dudes in play to really make it work. So we got a bunch of dudes here. We got you know, stuff like Fanatic, Grim Lavamancer, Jackalpop, Ball Lightning, which is pretty normal stuff. But we got Mog Conscripts, which is another 1 mana 2 power guy. But you need to cast a creature for this thing to do anything. Of course, Ashino Sandstalker. This card's pretty sweet. It's 3 mana, 4/2, and then returns to your hand at end of turn. So it's kind of like a little Ball Lightning. Nice sort of source of consistent sort of damage, even though it is, you know, kind of mana intensive. But it is pretty good against like Oath decks and stuff, having things like Fanatic and Ball Lightning and Sandstalker or whatever, where they're just not in play to trigger Oath if they need to be. So that's kind of sweet. We've got Final Fortune. Time Walk effects, of course, if you're not super familiar, Time Walk is kind of a weird card. Like sometimes its value can be like all over the place. So like of all the Power 9, its strength is most relative, most contextual to the deck you're playing. So Final Fortune is sweet because it's, you know, again, just like Time Walk, if you got a bunch of creatures. And this deck has a bunch of creatures. Oh boy, does it have a bunch of creatures. About 26. Just very, very creature heavy. And we don't play a ton of burn here in this deck. At least this guy didn't. Got Bolt, Fire Blast. Yeah. And of course you have pseudo burn spells, of course, like Reckless Charge, which is a real cool one. +3/+0, and then Flashback for 3 mana. And of course it gives haste, which is quite sweet, quite sweet. So that's a nice big burst of damage. And if you have a bunch of creatures, it's kind of like a Flashback Lightning Bolt in some respects. Obviously you need to have creatures, otherwise it doesn't do anything, but this deck has a lot of those. And of course Reckless Abandon is very, very good when you have a pile of creatures. Yeah, there's a pile of creatures in here. You know, sacking like your Ball Lightning to that must be pretty sweet. And your mana base, just typical Sly mana base of mountains, fetches, and barbarian ring. So yeah, um, again, like I said, I think I'm much more partial to like 20 lands and 2 rings, uh, especially with like the sideboard where you're boarding in vortexes and sometimes like more expensive cards like Anarchy or even something like Shattering Pulse, right, which is 5 mana to buy back. So sometimes you do your curve does go up after board. I mean, of course, just having more lands just makes your fire blasts a little better, where you can cast them a little more freely without being crippled by them. But yeah, this is pretty sweet. All the other cards in sideboard: Pyrokinesis, Pop, Flaring Pain, Crash, Crypt, um, Vortex, all this stuff. Yeah, it's all stock standard. But yeah, I love playing Final Fortune. That card's so sweet. Obviously, yeah, this deck can really get the most out of it, just slamming down tons and tons of damage. So that's cool. That's really cool, especially if your opponent's tapped out. You can go for big swing, Final Fortune, untap, big swing, maybe blast them or bolt them or something, for the win. So yeah, there you go. Yeah, so we went through a ton of stuff today. Maybe I should have put up more pictures. I don't know. Most of you guys know most of these cards already, so I try and put up stuff. I'm like, oh, this is relevant, or oh, this is worth talking about. But I think you guys mostly know all these cards, right? Right? All right. So, yeah, there we go. That's what we're doing. That was it. So thanks for stopping by, guys. Thanks for watching me talk about these sweet cards and sweet decks. And have a great day.